So welcome everybody to my talk on the Supernatural Selkie in Una McCormack's story, The Sea is Not Full. This is a paper that explores the mysterious and supernatural figure of the Selkie. And for this particular talk, I wanted to focus on this figure in the Irish imagination, because my study of this particular short story forms part of a wider bit of research that looks at Irish mythology, particularly through crime fiction. And Una McCormack's short story is a mystery text. So I'm kind of using this story as my case study to say some more about Selkies and how they function in crime fiction. So this particular story, The Sea is Not Full, I don't know whether people are familiar with it, but you may want to rush off and look at this particular book that it's in, namely the short story collection Requiems for the Departed, which was edited by Gerard Brennan and Mike Stone and published in 2010. It is absolutely brilliant, and I'll say a little bit more later on about this particular volume and the wider purpose that it serves in terms of challenging the representation of Irishness, and particularly bringing mythology and folklore into the equation. So I'll be providing some more context for this book later on. I also explore the general context for the figure of the Selkie, and how it's depicted in this short story, which is a historical crime fiction. And what that means is that it's not set in the contemporary times, but set at a previous period in history. In this case, very previous, because it's set in a kind of unspecified time, but before year 1000, when Romans had been attempting to colonize Ireland, and when Christianity was starting to impact on Ireland and its spirituality. So there are quite a few tensions already in the story that I'm hoping that you can start to detect. So because of this historical approach by McCormack, my talk also comments on the challenges of representing history and the supernatural through the mystery genre. Little bit first about Una McCormack. She is a British-Irish academic, scriptwriter and novelist. She's the author of The Baba Yaga and The Star of the Sea, 2 books in the Weird Space series from the UK science fiction publisher Abaddon Books. So she has quite an interesting background as an author. She's not a crime fiction author per se, but genre-wise, as a historical mystery short story, The Sea is Not Full seems to be a bit of a departure for her, but the fantasy element, I think, is what ties these different types of texts together and connects her main oeuvre to The Sea is Not Full. McCormack has also worked as an academic, and she has a PhD in sociology. And again, I feel that in this work that I'm looking at today, these academic interests are reflected in her careful historical research, which I'll also say more about as the paper wears on, and her attention to social and cultural hierarchies, which we see in the story. So The Sea is Not Full is set at a time when the Roman Empire had attempted to colonize Ireland, and the story reenacts this historical encounter, and starts to gesture at how it ended. The reader is obviously invited to make comparisons between the Roman colonizers and the later colonization by the British. So even though the story is a piece of historical fiction, like many historical fictions, it deals with a dual timeline, and of the tensions being kind of refracted and reflected across across the centuries. In the story, and I'm just going to give a bit of a summary so that people know what happens in the text. In the McCormack story, a Roman military commander called Avitus is sent to Ireland to oversee the settlement at Drogheda, north of Dublin. At this settlement, the Roman Empire has installed a local warlord who is obedient to Rome, and they've done that so that he can rule over the local population. When Avitus is visiting this small Irish settlement, he contemptuously reflects on what he perceives to be the barbarous ways and language of the Irish. He observes their poverty and disadvantaged living conditions, but without any empathy or awareness that actually their diminished situation is caused by his empire's exploitation of them. References are made to slaves, as well as to the influential people whom Avitus meets, such as the warlord himself, illustrating the social inequality in that settlement. What happens then is that Avitus is reluctantly drawn into a local family conflict when a teenage boy called Ronan comes to him pleading for him to help. Ronan's mother has disappeared, and he suspects his father of having murdered her and thrown her into the sea. At first, reluctant to get involved in a local matter, Avitus decides to use the opportunity to make an example to the local population of the Roman Empire's might. Inevitably, the example is one of cruelty and brutality. Because when the boy kills his father in order to avenge his mother, Avitus orchestrates a terrifying public execution of the boy. Roman is executed and his dead body thrown into the sea to be reunited with his mother. When Roman kills his father, Ronan is hung and flogged as a public spectacle of punishment. And the story describes this, saying, quote, Roman justice was carried out for the whole world to see. The young man was strung up on the gatepost, flogged, and when that was done, the body was weighted with stones and cast over the cliff into the sea, where his mother had no doubt gone before him, unquote. Avitus maintains that justice must be done and the law upheld. He has absolute faith in the law as the distinguishing factor, he thinks, between the Roman Empire and civilization and the Irish. He says, quote, it is the law which makes us Roman, the law which civilizes us, unquote. As Avitus and his men sail away from the settlement after the performative ritualistic execution, Avitus's translator, the half-Roman enslaved boy Cotric, tells him that the disappeared woman was rumored to be a Selkie, half woman, half seal. And Cotric speculates that perhaps she hadn't actually been murdered, but had in fact returned to the sea once again after having lived on land with humans. A Selkie is a seal person with a supernatural ability to transform themselves, shedding their seal skin to take human form when they are on land, and putting their skin on again when they return to the sea. It is said that, quote, the legend of the Selkie is found along the shores of Britain and Ireland. There are Selkie stories from Cornwall, Ireland, and most particularly the Northern islands of Scotland, the Orkneys, Shetlands, and Hebrides. Selkies can shed their sealskin on the land and pass for humans, usually with tragic consequences, unquote. So the story explores the complications and evasions of cultural and linguistic translation, showing how Irish culture and the legend of the Selkie are lost in translation for Avitus. From his boat, Avitus sees two seals swimming together in the sea. As he considers the miscarriage of justice which he has overseen and the challenge to his rationalistic worldview posed by the idea of the supernatural Selkie, Avitus turns to face the horizon as the ship sails from Ireland towards an unknown destination. The reader is left to ponder the fate of the Selkie and of her son Ronan, whose name means little seal, and to wonder what the truth is, whether this was a domestic violence type murder or whether there really is more between heaven and earth. The symbolic connection between the Selkie woman and her son's elusive and poignant name further emphasizes the text's challenge to rationality and the patriarchal order of empire. With the supernatural Selkie employed symbolically as a representation of trauma and haunting, the dark, brooding Gothic ambience of this cautionary tale ensures the reader continues to ponder the Selkie long after they've closed the story's final page. McCormack's The Sea is Not Full draws on the motif of the supernatural Selkie to illustrate Irish oppression and colonization in relation to gender, language, and cultural and spiritual beliefs. The story poses a parallel between the brutality of empire and its colonization and patriarchal violence. It is these two forces that give the story its Gothic overtones, blending Gothic nuances with the supernatural and crime. In the story, the supernatural Selkie functions as the disrupting power, which defies logic and whose mobility and affinity with the sea frightens the male characters of the story. The Selkie is a harbinger of patriarchal violence, a haunting power which reminds the reader of the domestic murder drama possibly at the heart of the story. The Selkie is a complex disruptive factor, a being that blurs the boundaries between human and animal. As a supernatural shapeshifter, McCormack uses the Selkie to write back to history and to challenge Irish history of colonization. The story shows that the Roman Empire never really gained control over Ireland due to their attempt to control the country using excessive violence and control, just like the Selkie shapeshifting and eventual return to the sea cannot be controlled by humans. The story's Gothic dimensions are its mystery, its sense of doom, dark thematic content, which construct a situation of both individual and collective transgression perpetrated in the private sphere, in relationships, and through the patriarchal colonizing ruling powers in the public sphere. The story also reflects another important Gothic dimension, namely its evocation of high emotion and focus on the natural sphere as an alternative space to the claustrophobic and forbidding social sphere depicted in the story. Una McCormack has written a preface to the story which clarifies the setting and also the creative impulse behind her reimagining of the shape-shifting Selkie in her 21st century short story. McCormack states, "The setting for The Sea is Not Full is based on Dromana, a headland 50 miles north of Dublin where Roman artifacts have been found in the past. The question of the Romanization of the Celtic world is, of course, a thorny one. However, the headland is in private hands, and legal proceedings on the part of the owners have prevented any further archaeology at the site or investigation of the artifacts already found. While all this mystery must be frustrating for archaeologists and historians, it is fertile territory for a fantasist interested in historical imagination and national myth-making. David Thompson's memorable book, The People of the Sea, an account of his journeys around the Hebrides and the west coast of Ireland and the stories that he heard there, was also a source of inspiration. People who do not fit into their skins, the slippery line between civilization and barbarism, and the bringing of law from across the sea, Look closely and you may glimpse St. Patrick coming. All of these are questions which I hope this story examines. Thus, establishing the setting for her story, McCormack connects it specifically to the discovery of these ancient Roman relics. In real life, there is a large Roman fort at Dromana, and it is this location which forms the basis for her story. The Sea is Not Full thus stages a powerful clash between historical realism and the supernatural and Gothic, and this makes for a poignant dissonance and tension in the story. The further contrast between these real historical relics and the elusive dreamlike supernatural Selkie serves to enhance the sense that both modes are textual constructions, artifices which depend on the reader's imagination to come into view. The excavation of historical remnants and the Selkie folklore in McCormack's story serves as a powerful allusion to silenced histories and marginalized perspectives, important themes with which the story uses the trope of the Selkie to explore. McCormack is one of numerous Irish or Irish diaspora crime writers to have explored Irish mythology and folklore, thereby calling attention to the politics of post-colonial literary and cultural production. Irish myths contain most powerful and enduring tropes of Irish identity and sensibility. They present depictions of gender and agency that challenge conventional ideas and trace the relationship to land and environment. Each of the crime stories in Requiems for the Departed is prefaced, like McCormack's was, with a short note by the individual author explaining their creative reflections and the connections between their text and Irish mythology. As Glenn Harper observes, all storytelling relates in some way to the old stories, the myths and legends of a culture, and crime fiction in particular frequently has a clear relationship to the violence, fatalism, and darkness of some of the old stories, themes that I'm sure we agree are also Gothic in nature. Furthermore, Alexander Gonzalez also links dimensions from Irish myth to crime fiction, highlighting what he calls the, quote, bawdy, violent, or transgressive elements from early Irish mythology and writing, unquote. Requiems for the Departed thus demonstrates how its texts recast dark crime themes from Irish myth and folklore to creatively rework local idioms and establish new terrains for this writing in a post-colonial context. So as we can see, Irish mythology remains important to the country's literary and cultural self-understanding, but do these myths travel, and what role do they play in contemporary Irish popular literature and culture? Chiara Ní Bhraoin states in her discussion of contemporary recasting of Irish myth for children that, quote, a century after Irish myths and legends were first translated and adapted for children, many writers are moving beyond traditional retellings to use myth as a source of inspiration for fantasy fiction exploring contemporary themes, unquote. This contemporary recasting of myth facilitates a wider debate of how genre fiction and popular culture engage with social and political questions and debates and the nature of their contributions. Some of the most poignant crime stories in Requiems for the Departed, that collection that McCormack's story is from, focus on animal imagery, motifs which have their grounding in Irish mythology and are used as a means of addressing inequalities caused by colonialism and environmental exploitation. Apart from its specific significance in Irish culture, the animal motif has an important role in the mystery genre. Sharon A. Russell explains that the animals have long played an important role in the mystery genre and are closely connected to detectives and sidekicks. Such folktale themes resonate far beyond the immediate historical setting of McCormack's tale, addressing individual experiences of marginalization and the misfits and outsider characters often portrayed in a crime short story. In his 2010 article in the Irish Times, and I've got some references at the end of these slides that I'll share with you, Declan Burke quotes the crime writer Brian McGilloway, who says of Requiems for the Departed, and I quote, "Mythology and crime writing are happy bedfellows. Myths tended to be a way for people to impose meaning on something which was beyond their understanding, or to reduce something which they feared to a level which they could comprehend, and thus remove the fear or make it manageable. Crime writing likewise imposes narrative and meaning on acts which in reality are often random and motiveless. Both myth and crime fiction bring the big abstract issues down to earth and express them in terms which we can better understand by placing them in a narrative form." The Irish colonial settlement that Una McCormack describes in The Sea Is Not Full is depicted as a very primitive setup, small dark huts made of peat with straw roofs. A sorry sight to men used to city life, Avitus calls the dwellings as he's looking at the huts. Avitus compares the huts to figures of people standing hunched together with their backs turned to the sea, a striking image which reflects the popular fear of the sea and the powers it represents, such as the Selkie. It's a small settlement, Avitus reckons, perhaps only 50 people in all. The men who guarded the hall, their families, and slaves. Commenting on colonization, Silvia Alonso Blanco argues that, quote, "In a context of colonization, minority groups have to endure the suppression by the dominant group of everything that represents them and might be an obstruction for the colonization project. In most cases, the empire starts attacking culture, base of any nation, and therefore root of nationalist feelings, depriving individuals of their own means of expression and imposing new ones turns them into subjects of the empire and even into possible future agents," unquote. So the Roman Empire never really gained control of Ireland, and perhaps this story kind of explains that by showing where the Romans went wrong in their attempt to control Ireland by using excessive violence and control. And here's a quote from the short story showing their attitudes, showing their frame of mind as they arrive to the settlement in Ireland. Quote, "As the men unloaded the boats of goods and arms, Avitus took in the land around them. Green grass, rain-soaked and wind-bitten, sloped upwards ahead at the top of the hill, a low wooden hall squatted. Smoke rose greasily from its roof. End of the fucking world, Gaius declared with morbid satisfaction. Avitus was inclined to agree. A small piece of land jutting out precariously into the sea, the unpromising hovel of a dubious chieftain. Such was the sum total of the empire's presence in Hibernia. This was no Diva Victrix, with its well-ordered streets and barracks, where his wife and daughters waited for him by the hearth, watched over by their household gods. Nor was it the wall of coast that stretched out to Mona with its chain of stone watchtowers and solid fortlets. After these had come the great open moor of the sea, and at the far side this bare land, the end of civilization, the end of the world. It's this otherness of the colonial realm that Avitus's greatest test of character is about to take place in, one which he fails miserably. In the story, the Roman attempt to colonize and control Ireland is an analogy of the British Empire colonizing Ireland. According to Silvia Alonso Blanco, who states, quote, "The colonization of Ireland by the British Empire left permanent scars and brought along terrible linguistic and cultural consequences for the Irish population. The merfolk, i.e. the Selkies, the merfolk are carefully reinvented as the perfect allegory of the Irish community, since it is at the same time a revival of the Celtic tradition muted by the English one, as well as a critique of colonial patronage," unquote. Although Blanco is not commenting here on McCormack's tale, but on other literary texts, the commonality of use of the Selkie figure as an allegory of the Irish community is striking. The story also raises the issue of spirituality and Christianity as another colonizing power. The Sea is Not Full draws on the Selkie using animal imagery to illustrate the problems of oppression and colonization. The Sea is Not Full is distinct through its return to this much earlier historical period in Irish culture, an unspecified time when Irish myths and gods began to give way to Christianity. The title of McCormack's story, "The Sea is Not Full," is a biblical reference to Ecclesiastes 1.7, which states that all streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place that streams come from, there they return again. The opening preface to the story goes, "And so I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of the holy, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done." It's also from Ecclesiastes 8:10. The meaning of this particular biblical passage is debatable. It's debatable or open to interpretation, but appears to suggest that those who seem to be devout or to attend to religious worship in the holy places are in fact also wicked. Avitus reflects on the arrival of Christianity in Ireland, thinking, quote, "At least there was no sign of the Christus, that cultish figure that had swept through the empire like a storm or a plague, stealing the clothes of the bull god to whom Avitus remained stubbornly loyal. Not this far, not yet. They would have their own gods here," in Ireland that is, "strange foreign gods of the trees and the waters. There would be barbarous rites, sacrifices," unquote. In contrast, the emerging conflict with Christianity is hinted at in McCormack's tale as the enslaved boy Cotric prays to, quote, "the new God, a God of slaves and women that was now the Lord of emperors," unquote. The story thus reenacts the clash between these cultures, highlighting issues of inequality and the consequences of a miscarriage of justice. Avitus sees himself as an upholder of justice and defender of the faith in a barbarian place. He reflects, quote, "Not magic, not a great tale or song. These were sordid crimes, barbarous, and the guilty had been punished for them as the laws declared they must, as the gods demanded. Submission, obedience, that was what was asked of a man," unquote. The end of the story poignantly illustrates how the spiritual and communal values of Irish culture continue to haunt Avitus as he sails back to the continent, watching the seals that follow the boat. The seals following the boat suggest a ghostly haunting as described by the post-colonial critic Stephanie Krapps, and are a reminder of the victims of the crimes perpetrated by empire. The closing lines of the story suggest a crime narrative where values are uncertain and subject to change, and where permanence gives way to slippage and change. Quote, "The world began to slip, and past and future merged, the boundary no longer tenable," unquote. McCormack thus problematizes the construction of boundaries between self and other, reality and the supernatural, human and Selkie, a boundary which myth and legend frequently challenge and blur in their representations. All those boundaries employed and evoked to stabilize our understanding of the world and its phenomena. The otherworldly and fluid nature of the Selkie figure highlights this ontological uncertainty and lack of fixity, and therein the story shows lies the power of the Selkie figure, but also its vulnerability. In McCormack's reimagining of the legend, the Selkie triggers social and cultural disruption, causing rifts and conflicts which become manifest through the colonizers' enactment of oppressive violence. The problematization of gender is played out in the key female characters in the story, most explicitly in Maureen, the tribal leader's wife, more implicitly in the Selkie figure. The story contrasts the seductive and powerful femininity of the tribal leader's wife with the more elusive and uncontrollable femininity of the Selkie woman. Both women are shown to represent stereotypes of gender, which the story challenges. Maureen is described through Avitus's perspective, and he clearly feels sexually attracted to her and is mystified by her at the same time. Avitus is unable to read Maureen and fears the way in which she is able to communicate using the local language, which he doesn't understand or master. He feels threatened by her, which is evident already the first time he's introduced to her, when he notes that she looks at him as though they were equals. As though they were equals. This very telling phrase demonstrates Avitus's resentful observation that Maureen is exceeding patriarchal hierarchies, according to which women are supposed to be subservient and occupy a lower position in the social hierarchy. The story uses this portrayal to challenge Avitus's narrative perspective and to indicate that his actions and reflections are shaped by his white male privilege. On several occasions, while they're questioning Ronan about the disappearance of his mother and his suspicions about his father, Maureen is described as communicating quietly with her husband, too quietly for Avitus to hear, which vexes him even further. Avitus attempts to exploit a conflict which he instigates between husband and wife in order to regain control of the situation. However, Maureen has the last laugh in exchange as she sets Avitus up for a fall. She tells him that he should decide how Ronan should be punished, because Ronan is half Roman and therefore should receive Roman justice, she says. By being trapped this way into administering the justice which ultimately alienates him from the Irish, Avitus is shown to be the weaker one, enthralled as he is to his own vanity and sense of masculine superiority. Maureen's final lines in the story are, quote, "There has been no victory here, but all our vanities have now, I think, been served," unquote. This chilling pronouncement refers back to the story's prefatory quote from Ecclesiastes, "And so I saw the wicked buried, who'd come and gone from the place of the holy, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done." Having drawn this extensive context, and I want to say a few things about McCormack's representation of the Selkie, and draw out more of the Gothic allusions in the story associated with the Selkie. Alonso Blanco states that a Selkie is, quote, "the epitome of how women are affected and systematically oppressed by colonization and patriarchal systems. Because once enjoining humans on land, the Selkie has to abandon her homeland underwater and follow the group in their exile. Once on mainland, she also has to endure the adaptation process and deal with the trauma, which implies suppressing everything that shapes one's identity, culture, language, tradition," unquote. I want to look at specifically at the first time the Selkie is described in the story and introduced both as a motif and a character. This is a very interesting passage because, again, the sequence is seen through Avitus's eyes, and he's kind of sneering and contemptuous of the whole Irish thing, resents having to be there among the barbarians. But when the Selkie first makes its appearance, something shifts. And I'll quote, When the boat was securely tied, Avitus strode out onto the land, small stones crunching beneath his boots. Behind him, Gaius, thicker set and less agile, slipped on the wet rock, all but losing his footing. He cursed loudly and bluntly, and the sound startled a seal mother resting on the sands nearby. Quick as sunshine between showers, she slid into the sea. A little way out, she stopped and turned, sleek head bobbing up above the water, soft eyes bright and wary of the intruders, and she called to her pup to follow. Unquote. The conjoined gender colonialism theme here is powerfully conveyed. The supernatural Selkie slips away as she senses the men approaching. What startles her is the loud cursing of Avitus's fellow soldier as he loses his grip on the rocks they're walking on, losing his foothold as he finds himself on the unfamiliar land of the other. The Selkie is described as quick as sunshine and wary of intruders. At this point, the reader doesn't yet know that this is the Selkie. They only see a description of the natural scenery and its animals, which happens to include seals. However, the portrayal of the Selkie's mesmerizing quicksilver speed and nebulous movement leaves a trace in the text, a disruption hinting at the grim inevitability of the story's crime plot. A plot which the reader soon suspects was always already going to end in the colonial power's ritual performative bloodshed in the most brutish of ways. So the Gothic element of the story is less to do with the Selkie than with patriarchal and colonial violence, because this is not a monstrous Selkie. However, the weight of the Selkie's representation and significance grows as the story wears on. The power of the Selkie to disrupt becomes evident when the story's examination of violence begins. Avitus hears the father and husband of the disappeared woman plead his case. He explains that his wife was like no other woman, an exceptionality that perhaps once again is indicative of her true Selkie nature. Quote, "Gone, the lady of the house had said, gone home, gone back. What had she meant by that?" Unquote. There's an implicit understanding by everyone in the room except Avitus, for whom this doesn't translate, that the woman is a Selkie. Avitus is a cultural outsider and adheres to the colonizer's rigid view of justice, that he is responsible for administering it, no, not the one on the receiving end. However, this perception is also subverted by the story's ending and by the preface. At the end of the story, as the Romans sail away from the settlement, the translator boy Kotrick recounts the legend of the Selkie to Avitus. Quote, "Beneath his grip, the boy struggled to master himself, biting his bottom lip enough to draw blood. He wiped at his mouth. Sometimes," he said, "they told stories about the people who came from the sea. Seals, I think they meant. Sometimes they would shed their skins and come and walk amongst the folk of the land. That was lucky, they said. And if you found the skin of one while it was walking upright amongst men, and you hid the skin away, then they would forget where they'd come from, and that would keep the good luck with you, so long as they didn't go near the sea. Then they would remember where they came from and go back again." Unquote. This retelling, of course, serves as a powerful reminder to the reader of the Selkie legend and its significance to the story, but also stresses that the Selkie will always return to the sea in the end. Hence the other meaning of the story's title, "The Sea is Not Full." The sea is not complete until the Selkie has returned to her original natural state and domain. Kotrick then tells Avitus about the disappeared woman and how she was a Selkie. Quote, "But that other woman, the one Avitus had not even seen, but whose absence had all but founded an alliance." Unquote. "The only one with a kind word, I think. She knew how it felt to be among strangers," the boy says. "She often sang about the sea, but I never saw her near it. Perhaps that's what happened. Perhaps they stole her from the sea, and then she went down there one day and remembered where she came from, and she went back, leaving her man and her boy behind, to love her and miss her and fall upon each other like savages." Unquote. Avitus and Cotric both decide to leave the myth of the Selkie to superstition, and because Cotric believes he knows what really happened, that this was a heathen story from a heathen land, their conversation founders. Avitus rejects the idea of the supernatural Selkie. Instead, the story explains, it was clear enough what had happened, clear as the sky after rain. A man had killed his wife through rage or love or both, and their son had exacted a revenge on behalf of a beloved mother. Not magic, not a great tale or song, these were sordid crimes, unquote. The story thus subtly communicates that Avitus, contrary to his belief, is not beyond or above justice himself. But as Avitus looks over the ship's side into the water, he sees not one but two seals in the water. Has the boy returned to the sea to join his mother? There is thus a profound ambiguity and hesitation at the end of the story, suggesting a gap in which the Gothic, the excess of transgression, can exist. Quote, turning, Avitus saw the last of the land slide into the water. Below the surface, two dark shapes were swimming, lithe and free. They followed the ship for a while and then went on their way. Unquote. The final lines of the story blur the boundaries between times and entities, calling into question the solidity of rational thought and historical fixity, suggesting instead a world of interconnection where the boundary between self and other is broken down. Quote, the world began to slip like bare feet on the wet rock, and past and future merged, the boundary no longer tenable, unquote. Molly Ferguson has said on the Irish ghost story and its preoccupation with the supernatural as a means of reckoning with the past and the present. Quote, though ghost stories and supernatural tales have existed from the earliest oral literature in Ireland, these stories are reinvented each generation as manifestations of past traumas and current vexations that the Irish are facing at this time of writing. The collective memory of the culture to promote a self-identity distinct from its colonial past, ghost stories tap into structures of communal storytelling that are adapted to express encoded fears about the present, thus, quote unquote, also hinting at that dual timeline that I mentioned before. So to finish then, at the end of The Sea is Not Full, the Selkie has returned to the sea and to her seal-like natural form, rather than being a victim of patriarchy or a projection for male fantasies, another aspect treated extensively in McCormack's story. The Selkie is able to free herself and evade control. The ending of the story and the significance of it for the depiction of colonization in Ireland and the attitude of the colonizer to the destruction they wreak, thus sailing away from the consequences of their actions. The supernatural is used as part of that critique. The end of the story saw Avitus considering his unbending view of justice and hierarchy and how he fits himself within that hierarchy as someone obliged to take orders from those above him. We see in Joseph Conrad's 1899 novel, Heart of Darkness, the ultimate price to be paid for dehumanizing the other and administering punishment accordingly. McCormack's powerful story uses the figure of the Selkie to challenge and disrupt these binary structures and hierarchy, as the Selkie evades victimization and returns to the sea uncontrolled and uncolonized. And that was the end of my paper, and I've just put on the final slide here a list of some of my resources that I have consulted. As you can see, I list one of my books called Murder in a Few Words, Gender, Genre and Location in the Crime Short Story, which features a chapter on Irish mythology and the crime short story and the discussion of this particular text by Una McCormack. So if you're hungry for more Irish mythology, check out this source. But that is it. So I will finish